Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Hello everybody, welcome to this special edition of Windows on the World. We're actually going out on a Wednesday night, might be doing a few more of these, and also I'll be talking to Eric Von Essex tomorrow night on Facebook. Also on the Eric Von Essex YouTube channel, we're going to have a chat about what's going on locally. Tonight though, we're going to talk how things are implemented globally. And that's what we're talking about tonight. We go on about this a lot in our talks, the bigger picture, also known as the Real People's Assembly. The thing about whistleblowers is that often they're not listened to at the time. In the case of the whistleblower we're going to talk about tonight, he is not even being listened to now, some years after his death. He was warning people what was going to happen, how the world was going to be re-engineered in 1987. And we're going to get into that, what it was all about, and how it ties into now, because it does tie into now. Everything that is happening in the present time was predicted in 1987. And the key players involved in this are known to many people. However, they're not really aware of the detail. But first of all, let's get into the planning of societal change. This is how it all works. There has to be a plan for societal change. And these plans for societal change take place decades before the public see any signs of the implementation, which is why the public will say that sounds like a conspiracy theory, because it isn't literally throttling them round the neck. By this time, it is being sold to them in a form of a benefit, you see. That's what happens. So everything that has to be implemented has to be done for the public good, doesn't it? It has to be done in the form of a benefit. In the present time, we're paying benefice, which is basically to save the earth, we're going to be taxed and we're going to give up all our rights. But it's for the common good, so we should do it. And we're going to get into how this all works and the psychology behind it, because the psychology behind this is the most important thing. Now, the public are not excluded from looking for these ongoing plans. There's nothing secret about this, but they're not looking for them, so they don't see the signs of change that are going on. They don't pick up the signs of change, and most will never be able to see the plans behind these changes as they believe the cover story. Everything has to be done as it appears to the public for their benefit. It has to be for the greater good, otherwise they wouldn't agree to it, or they might not agree to it. So the change has to be brought about on the back of something which appears beneficial to the public. The public then accept the change as necessary or for the common good. They are guilt-tripped into accepting loss of rights and benefits. Now, a good example of this is, well, I pay me taxes, why don't you? This is groupthink, the hive mind, which then demonises anything outside the controlled, accepted narrative. Fear of being singled out keeps the flock in line. And now you're called a denier, a right-wing extremist, or even a conspiracy theorist. These terms now have no meaning whatsoever, but they're used to smear opposition. Indeed, we reported on Sunday how our group, myself, Piers Corbyn and Sandy Adams, had been smeared by the Greens, the fake Greens, the totalitarian Greens, who are implementing an agenda which most of them don't even understand. I'm going to get into that tonight and where it all came from. If there's any people who vote for the Green Party or are members of Friends of the Earth, you might find this interesting. If you're still listening in 10 minutes' time, that is. So don't switch off and don't think it's a conspiracy theory, because That's what you've been programmed to think. We're going to give you information which is in the public domain. Now, this is the basis of how society works in the present technocratic age. The societal structure of power implements all of this control through the executive, judicial, and administrative arms of governance. Interested and promoted lobbyists, like the Greens, exploit this for their own advantage and indirectly for the advantage of the state. Often, these people don't know what they're really implementing because they're thinking of it as the greater good. They can't see the policy behind it. So, this is the basis of how society works in this sort of present technocratic age. Now, I'm going to get on to something very interesting here, and it ties in to the whole concept of what we're going to be talking about of how things are implemented. Let's talk now about the blending of fire and water. Now, this comes from the Rosicrucian concept of Cain, Abel and Set. Now, you're probably thinking, where is he going with this? Well, it's very important as to what we're going to be talking about, because it's a concept for governance, and it's a concept which brought together the idea of what is called sustainable development, or basically the New Green Deal. The thing that the government has signed up for to be carbon neutral, the blending of fire and water. This comes from the Rosicrucian concept of Cain, Abel and Set. The Rosicrucians were a group that was set up in the 1600s, and they wanted to recruit the best brains on the planet. How did they go about this? They put an advert in a paper, and it was all coming out of small town in Germany. And people wrote in, basically gave all their details to this group who they didn't know about. And what a great way to find out all of the revolutionary minds and all the great thinkers. What a great way to corral them all. A bit like Google, except this was done in the 16th century. And it was a very clever concept, and a lot of disinformation has been written about this group, and there's a lot of mystery and allegory around it. Basically, it was a good business plan to get interesting people on board and to compromise people and to find out who was thinking what. It was a surveillance exercise, if you think about it practically. Now, the blending of fire and water, the Rosicrucian concept is that the sons of Cain are fire and the sons of Abel are water, as are the sons of Set. Now, this is very important because in 1987, Edmund de Rothschild at the World Wilderness Congress described the banks as being the fire to bring the concept of development into environmentalism. So in other words, the blending of fire and water is this. Fire would be the development through the banks, and the water would be the environmental movement, which is ruled by water. So you've got the blending of fire and water. In other words, the fire is going to control the water. Now, the water of conservation, on the other hand, brought about this synthesis of fire and water. So basically, it's all done under this banner of conservation. It's an alchemical mix and a brilliant business plan, which was to be the wrapper for the present global governance. The inciting document for all this, and you can look it up, it's not a conspiracy theory, the inciting document was a book called Our Common Future, which laid out the implementation of this global project. Let's just go into what Our Common Future was all about. Our Common Future was produced by the World Commission on Environment and Development, headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was then the Prime Minister of Norway. Let's see what it says about Our Common Future, which you can still buy. You look it up on the internet, you can buy it for about £3 or £4. Most of today's decision makers will be dead before the planet suffers the full consequences of acid rain, remember that, global warming, ozone depletion, remember that, widespread desertification and species loss. Most of today's young voters, however, will be alive. Can you see what this is about? Get the young involved. This was in 1987. In this, perhaps the most important document of the decade on the future of the world, the urgency of changing certain policy decisions, some of which threaten the very survival of the human race, is made abundantly clear. The World Commission on Environment and Development, headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, was set up as an independent body in 1983 by the United Nations. And out of this came this document, Our Common Future. Its brief was to re-examine the critical environment, to develop proposals to solve them, and to ensure that human progress will be sustained through development without bankrupting the resources of future generations. It says, in Our Common Future, the Commission serves notice that the time has come for a marriage of economy and ecology, the fire and the water there, so that governments and their people can take responsibility not just for environmental damage, but for the policies that cause the damage. This is it, the benefice. We get charged to live. We get charged to breathe because we are a cancer on the earth. That's where it all came from. It's not too late to change these policies, it said, but warns that we must act now. Wait a minute, act now? I've seen that somewhere before, haven't you? Haven't you seen that phrase, act now? Yes, by the latest globalist lobbying group, Extinction Rebellion. Now, the result of all this was the Rio Summit, the Rio Earth Summit of 1992, also known as UNCED, United Nations Conference on Environmental and Development, brought about by Maurice Strong through the UN. Maurice Strong was a billionaire who came out of the oil industry. So all of you people who think that it's the oil industry who are backing fossil fuels, no. It's actually both sides. The oil industry benefits from artificial scarcity. So that's not really the point with Maurice Strong. He was basically a businessman and he had a very clever business plan. And he brought in this idea of New Age global governance. Now, I'm going to play you an audio because this is where the fire came into the concept. Now, we're going to hear now from someone who was at the World Wilderness Conference in 1987. He's part of the fire of the project, and it's called David Lang. He was a Montreal banker. This is what David Lang said to the assembled congregation, which included Edmund de Rothschild and Maurice Strong.
I suggest, therefore, that this be sold not through a democratic process. That would take too long and devour far too much of the funds to educate the cannon fodder, unfortunately, which populates the earth. We have to take almost an elitist program that we can see beyond our swollen bellies and look to the future in time frames and in results which are not easily understood or which can be, with intellectual honesty, be reduced down to some kind of simplistic definition.
The simplistic definition he's talking about there is sustainable development. So in other words, they had this plan which the cannon fodder were not really going to understand, so they called it sustainable development. And that was David Lang, who's a Montreal banker, speaking to the assembled invitees. Now, this is where we get on to the man who saw the future. We're going to talk about George Hunt, who found himself privy to the plan that was going to be the main driving force of global economic policy in the next 50 years. In 1987, a man called George Hunt found himself at this World Wilderness Congress. Now, he died on December the 23rd, 2013. And we're going to hear all about him, but in his testimony, he said, "I am educating the public to understand that a secret bank was set in motion by international financier Edmund de Rothschild. The bank will eventually be the only bank to exist as banks merge with one another into a larger bank. As the large and small banks topple toward large banks, where will it stop? The ultimate bank may be the bank privy Edmund de Rothschild, which was created in Geneva, Switzerland, a month after the aforementioned UNCED, United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development Wilderness Congress, was held in 1987. It is presently known as the World Conservation Bank." Now, this is where it gets interesting and new information comes in, because we have a new name for this organisation. However, what we must remember is that the World Bank is a conservation bank. And that's very important. So, the bank will promote conservation, it said here, but judge the hypocrisy of UNCED's Maurice Strong, Rothschild's right hand, as he brazenly attempts to circumvent Colorado water laws and ruin valuable farmland. Now, Maurice Strong had purchased a huge ranch in Colorado called the Baca, where he and his wife, Hannah, held New Age and multi-faith ceremonies, heralding in a new world order and a new world religion. Strong was exposed by George Hunt as trying to privatise the water supply of this approximately 200,000 acre ranch. So what you've got here is somebody who's advocating world communism, but is actually a capitalist. So it's a mixture of the two, again, fire and water, to the blending of the two things. Now, George Hunt stated in 1987, the bank utilises the media to spread environmental fears. Does this all start to sound familiar? I mean, look where we are now. It couldn't be more obvious, could it? He says spreading these fears will justify monstrous, inoperative greenhouse effect projects for the greedy rich and fat contracts. Some scientists have stated that they have serious questions concerning the lack of scientific methods and false or inadequate presumptions that may have been used in the environmental studies. Maurice Strong stated that there was no better person to spearhead this project than Edmund de Rothschild, and that he epitomises in his own life that positive synthesis between environment and conservation on the one hand, and economics on the other. In other words, Rothschild is the leader of both international finance and this pseudo-environmentalist movement resting on the two pillars, the claim of anthropogenic global warming and that of population control. Of course, the Rothschilds are making massive amounts of money for this, says George Hunt. They are the leaders in the carbon trading market, according to a recent press release. And the press release is actually attached here. I'm going to put all this up on Windows on the World. And actually, I'm going to put a longer version on Patreon. So please support us on Patreon, because there's going to be quite a lot of interesting stuff going up there, including our new film, which you can be part of. So do have a look at that. He says, but as the presentation shows, said George Hunt, their intentions are not only to make massive amounts of money, but also to ensnare the populace with a new web of social control. We can see the outlines of this operating today, he said then. Of relevance is the document called Trading Emissions Full Global Potential. And this is a document that was from the Social Market Foundation. And this is all the stuff that I've been looking up today. It was written by Simon Linnett, the Executive Vice Chairman of NM Rothschild, London. In the document, he defined greenhouse emissions as the new form of social market. It's crazy, this, isn't it? It couldn't be laid out more obviously. So why don't the public know about it? Or why don't the public want to know about it is more the important thing. George Hunt spent the rest of his life trying to expose this. And you can still go to thebigbadbank.com and purchase his DVDs there. But this is the thing. How many people actually listen to this stuff? Well, obviously not very many, because none of this is a conspiracy theory. It was all talked about in the early 80s, and it was reported all over the world by one man who happened to get into that conference. So, it says, in the document, Greenhouse Emissions as the New Form of Social Market, Simon Linnett, the Executive Vice Chairman of NM Rothschild London, said that such a market has to be established on a world basis, coordinated by an international institution with a constitution to match. Okay, maybe this is where the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came in, because that's mentioned quite a lot in these documents, that one super agency would basically control the narrative. So in other words, you've got your own bought and paid for scientists. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory either, is it? Because this is where it came from. We're going to give you more on that as the show goes on. He says, perhaps one can see a way to achieve this goal through leadership, vision, and some marginal and manageable renunciation of national sovereignty. How the world might just get there. Get that again. The renunciation of national sovereignty, basically to a global superpower, right? Implicit in all the above is that nations have to be prepared to subordinate to a certain extent some element of their sovereignty to this world initiative. He stated that regulating this would be a World Environment Authority. The IPCC, there you go, operating from a world city with world skills and world facilities. He then notes in a section entitled The Natural Role in London, London is a world financial centre, possibly the world financial centre, and that London would make a compelling case to house the World Environmental Agency. Okay, so they were talking about putting this together from the early 80s. The leaders of this movement advocate tyrannical world government and mass depopulation. Yes, they really do. It's in the documents. This is illustrated by a chilling document written by the UN magnate Maurice Strong, an agent of Edmund de Rothschild that was taken from the conference that George Hunt attended. This is what was said in a Club of Rome document. The time is pressing. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968. Limits to Growth was written in 1971. Limits to Growth is where a lot of these ideas came from. Global 2000 was written in 1979. But it says here insufficient progress had been made in population reduction in these publications. So let's see what Limits to Growth actually said. Limits to Growth. The first global revolution was a later document. So the first global revolution stated that because of the sudden absence of traditional enemies, new enemies must be identified. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. This is where the idea came from. Okay, it carries on. Given global instabilities, including those of the former Soviet bloc, the need for firm control of world technology, weaponry and resources is absolutely mandatory. The immediate reduction of world population, according to the mid-1970s recommendation of the Draper Fund, must be immediately affected. The present vast overpopulation, now far beyond the world carrying capacity, cannot be answered by future reductions. In the birth rate due to contraception, sterilisation and abortion, but must be met in the present by the reduction of numbers presently existing. This is all out of this document that came out of N.M. Rothschild. This must be done by whatever means necessary. Get this again. The present vast overpopulation, now far beyond the world carrying capacity, cannot be answered by future reductions in the birth rate due to contraception, sterilisation and abortion, but must be met in the present by the reduction of numbers presently existing. So, there you go. That's what they said. This must be done by whatever means necessary. Compulsory cooperation is not debatable with 166 nations, most of whose leaders are irresolute, conditioned by localist cultures and lacking the appropriate notions of the New World Order. Debate only means delay and forfeiture of our goals and purpose. We are the living sponsors of the great Cecil Rhodes Will of 1877. We stand with Lord Milner's credo. We too are British race patriots, and our patriotism is the speech, the tradition, the principles, the aspirations of the British race. Now there you go. What would the Greens say to that? They'd say that sounds like extreme far right. Well, no, these are the people who gave them their agenda. The Security Council of the UN, led by the Anglo-American nation powers, will decree that henceforth all nations have quotas for reduction on a yearly basis, which will be enforced by the Security Council by selective or total embargo of credit, food, medicine or military force when required. Outmoded notions of sovereignty will be discarded, and the Security Council has complete legal and military and economic jurisdiction in any region in the world to be enforced by the major nations of the Security Council. The Security Council of the UN will explain that not all races are equal, nor should they be. Those races proven superior by superior achievements ought to rule the lesser races, caring for them on sufferance that they cooperate with the Security Council. All could be lost if opposition by minor races is tolerated, and the vacillations of those we work with, our closest comrades, is cause for our hesitations. Open declaration of intent followed by decisive force is the final solution. So this is what the Green Agenda came out of. It came out of what these people who are enforcing it unknowingly would call Nazism, right? The final solution. They actually said the final solution. And remember, this is coming from somebody who works for NM Rothschild. Okay. Now, incidentally, at this point, I'd like to let you know that this is very much in the present. Incidentally, the next World Wilderness Congress is called Wild 11, and it's in 2020 in India next year, and will take control of 50% of the Earth's land and seas through the United Nations. The 11th World Wilderness Congress, it says here, is an essential milestone on the way to the historic 2020 decision in China. Wild 11's goal is twofold. Get this is from their website, Wilderness 11. 1, to influence the global decision-making process and create new leadership so we seize this critical moment in history. 2, take the ambitious and necessary step of agreeing to protect and interconnect at least 50% of Earth's land and seas. They aim to launch a BRICS-based, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, based leadership committee and in-country social movements, loads of NGOs, loads of new organisations springing up all the time. How many of these NGOs are there? Worldwide, hundreds of thousands, all working to the same template. And then we've got Extinction Rebellion, which is merely an arm of this. In-country social movements to influence policy agendas. What are Extinction Rebellion doing? Influencing policy agendas in some of the world's largest and most biodiverse countries. The Survival Challenge, a formal declaration signed by leaders from all sectors of society in all corners of the planet, calling for the United Nations to end the sixth extinction by protecting half of Earth, outlining what is expected from the world's leaders. What is expected from the world's leaders? In other words, this is above national government. Now, the document from 1987, Our Common Future, was meant to be ensuring a sustainable level of population, which means population reduction, reorientating technology and managing risk. That means smart cities, surveillance and data gathering. Merging environment and economics in decision making. That's what we've just talked about, corporate land grab. The UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, should be strengthened. This is what it said in Our Common Future as the principal source on environmental data assessment and agent for change and international cooperation on critical environment and national resource protection issues. That is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was formed in 1996, I think. Okay? So they were talking about it in 1987. The UN Environmental Programme should be strengthened as the principal source on environmental data. 97% of scientists agree. I wonder why. Assessment and agent for change and international cooperation on critical environment and national resource protection issues. Are there any journalists that have ever brought this up in any newspaper anywhere? I can't think of one. UNEP's Earthwatch programme should be the centre of leadership to the UN system on risk assessment. A new international programme for cooperation amongst largely non-governmental organisations, scientific bodies and industry groups should therefore be established for the purpose. The UN IPCC, which feeds all the NGOs with their climate change apocalypse rhetoric. Okay, let's carry on with this. It says making difficult choices will depend on widespread public support, controlling the narrative there. An involvement of an informed public, meaning a brainwashed public who are brainwashed into the new form of benefice, which is climate change apocalypse. Scientific bodies will be included and industry groups should therefore be established for the purpose. There you go. There's your 97% of scientists agree. All sorted out. Making difficult choices will depend on widespread public support and involvement of an informed public. Yes. The World Bank is presently reorientating its programme towards greater environmental concerns. What a surprise. This should be accompanied by a fundamental commitment to sustainable development by the bank. It is also essential that the regional development banks and the IMF incorporate similar objectives in their policies and programmes. This is an instruction manual for global governance. It says the changes in human attitudes that we call for depend on a vast campaign of education, debate and public participation. Oh, that couldn't be your citizens' assemblies on climate change that they control, could it? I think it could be. Remember, this is 1987 we're talking about here. The Elite Plan Well Ahead. That was the title of one of George Hunt's videos. Look it up, The Elite Plan Well Ahead. There must be more redistribution of power. How are individuals in the real world to be persuaded or made to act in the common interest? Well, like we said in the opening, they are made to act in the common interest through being forced and guilt-tripped into being part of a herd mentality that believes in anthropogenic global warming and wants to be taxed for it and believes that they are a blot on the earth, as they were instructed to be by the Club of Rome in that mission statement. Yes, it says the answer lies partly in education or brainwashing, institutional development, again, corporate brainwashing, NGOs, putting it into schools, put it into classrooms, put it into all sectors of local governance. And get this, law enforcement. So you've got the administrative, the judicial branches here, and you've got it going into law enforcement. It then becomes policy, and it became policy within the early 2000s. All this was written into local action plans in your local council. Most important, it says, effective participation in decision-making processes by local communities, here we go, can help them articulate and effectively enforce the common interest. Go back again to what we said at the beginning of the show, and that's how I laid this out. This is how they did it. Right, let's move on a bit forward now to our global neighbourhood in 1996. Read that. Read it on the internet. We've got many quotes from that. Look then at enablers of global governance from the summit this year in Dubai, 2019. Basically, these principles are the core of all policy globally, and they are implemented through all governments in the world. And they tell you this, so it's not a conspiracy theory. Let's go into the background of George Hunt now. This is the fella who is our whistleblower. He's dead now, but he spent the rest of his life, after being at that conference in 1987 trying to expose what was going on, he actually stopped Maurice Strong from privatising the water underneath his 200,000 acre ranch. Maurice Strong then fled to China. And for people who think, how can one person do all this? Maurice Strong, that is. Well, globalists have a lot of money, power and influence, and they think big. The public think very small. This man's thought very big. Go and have a look at a documentary on Maurice Strong. You can find it on YouTube. It's still there. What an interesting man. But what came out of him was this draconian global governance. Yes, it came out of him and Edmund Rothschild, with a little help from his friends. Okay, let's get on to George Hunt now. George Washington Hunt served as a naval officer on cruisers and destroyers, held corporate positions for 8 years, and worked as an entrepreneur in the health industry. He taught small businesses, management and accounting. He was a professor at college level for 5 years and started a health corporation in 1991, which became very profitable. He then sold it and retired in 2009. He was a dedicated conservationist and in turn lost a career business because he stood up for nature. Mr. Hunt is here to inform everyone, it said at the time, of the concept of the Big Bad Bank.com. Still there. It is ready for implementation. That's what he was saying in 1987. Whenever the directors feel the right time occurs, probably after the world's currency systems fail and there is chaos everywhere. Now, they don't need to do this because it all came into policy from Rio onwards. Remember, he was talking about this before Rio. It is presently called the World Conservation Bank. Okay, now we've got a new name for this, the Global Environmental Facility, and we're going to get onto that. Now, this is where it starts to come into the present. It's absolutely fascinating. It was called the World Conservation Bank, but may be open in the name of the United Nations or as a private Rothschild bank. It's the World Bank, actually. The World Bank is the global governing bank. The bank will replace all banks. There will be one bank. It will issue the world currency, make loans and finance huge conservation programs. Its power will be great. It could bring any nation to its knees just by adjustments to credit and currency. The name of the bank is not that important, as the World Bank heads the whole operation. Now we now have the Global Environmental Facility. We're going to get onto that in a minute, which was formed after the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. Next, we're going to get into what George Hunt had to say about this. Now, this is from an interview which was from the 14th of January 2010, and we're going to get onto that audio next. And this is George Hunt and what he had to say.
I went to the Fourth World Wilderness Congress at September 11th, 1987. I went there because my son had been killed in a wilderness area the later part of the year, or about a few months before, and I was very sad. And also, my other son that was still living said he wanted to repair huts along the Arctic for travelers, and he wanted to get into a job. So I heard the Fourth World Wilderness was coming to town, and with all its reindeer and pretty little bright lights, and I said, maybe I could go there and rub shoulders with the Smokies, with the forest rangers, and get my son a job. And so I went down to the Congress, and I saw the pictures of the reindeer and so on. But then I noticed on the program that there was another aspect away from Denver. The first 2 days of this wilderness Congress is supposed to be pro-conservation. The first 2 days were in Denver, and then they moved a quasi-secret meeting up to the YMCA of Estes Park, Colorado. So, with my resourceful mind, I said to myself, I'd like to get into that Congress, but I didn't have any money. And then, lo and behold, I got the information that one of the official hosts of the meeting was ill with the flu. I got his number. I called him. He says, yeah, take my place. I was interviewed by about four people. Among them were psychics, and they approved me as an official host. Yeah, psychics, the cults, the witches, the devils, the near rich that want to get into the crowd. I had luncheon with the Rothschilds. They were very nice people. Lady Rothschild stood up when I came to the table, and she filled my glass. And suddenly I said, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies, my cup runneth over. And I was with the president of the World Conservation Bank, and I said, Michael Sweetman, how is this bank going to survive if the asset base is Arctic lands? They don't produce any dividends and interest. He says, we are worried. We are working on that, he said in his precise English. I said, you're working on it, and you're going to have a seminar and a half an hour where you're going to accept this bank? What's going on, Michael? He said, you'll have a chance to ask us at the seminar. I looked him in the eye. I said, Michael, are you going to call on me? Look me in the eye, Michael. Yes, I promise. Well, we went to the seminar, and of course, he didn't call on me. It was a contrived Congress, and they accepted the bank. And we haven't seen it yet, but it's coming down the road. There will be one bank, one credit card, one of everything. And if you cross that bank and don't do what they want or the owners want, you'll lose your credit card privilege, and you won't be able to buy or sell. This is a conspiracy going on. It's no longer a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact. Fellow workers came up to me and they said, George, we have to talk to you about something. David Rockefeller has sent us a message that if you don't keep your mouth shut, you're going to regret it. Shortly after that, after the meeting, I was talking with a talk show host, and he said, did you get Guillain-Barré syndrome yet? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, GBS. It seems like everyone that gets close to the bone with world order gets it. Well, I just got out of the hospital with GBS. So there's something there, don't you think? Got the tape of the events. As far as I know, it's the only tape in existence. Now, then after the Congress, I went down, some Christians down in San Luis Valley called me, and they said, George, you have to come down here. Maurice Strong is up to all kinds of tricks. And that's where I was able to, through them, expose Maurice Strong's water scam, that he was going to pump water to cities and turn the San Luis Valley, thousands of miles, into a dust bowl. So here's the convener of the Environment Congress that met in Estes Park, going down 200 miles to the San Luis Valley and turning the place into a dust bowl. It was that hypocrisy that caused me to invest up till now $250,000 in exposing this guy. And I've got some information today for you that is going to blow. Oh, I've infiltrated many meetings, but not one of this importance, because the Secretary of the Treasury, Baker, was there, the head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank, Rothschild, Edmund de Rothschild, the chief banker of the world, David Rockefeller, da-da-da-da, and I knew there was something going on. It would take an idiot.
Yeah, it would take an idiot not to know, and the thing is that George Hunt was the only person who spoke about this afterwards. This is very fascinating because it shows you how these things are implemented. The public aren't really that bothered. They don't take any notice of what's going on. And that fascinating recollections of George Hunt there, because when we look at now what's going on, all of this was predicted 30 to 40 years ago. These people work with a 50-year plan at least. So this event that George Hunt attended was the precursor to the Rio Earth Summit, the World Wilderness Congress of 1987, which was put into force by Maurice Strong and Edmund Rothschild. It's where the Earth Charter co-author, Maurice Strong, did indeed introduce his friend Edmund Rothschild. Edmund Rothschild introduced CO2 as the cause of man-made global warming. CO2, therefore, had to be caught at the poles and transported away in order to lower warm Arctic and Antarctic temperatures, and perhaps dumped in the Sahara. This is what they thought of then. He suggested dry ice be sprayed at the poles to cool them down. This was accepted with hushed silence by the conference attendees. This was then accepted without discussion at the UN Rio Summit in 92. Edmund Rothschild can be heard on the video stating this needs money. Mr. Rothschild knows about money, obviously, it's his business. Now, the administrator of the new global financial system of climate change is Global Environmental Facility. This is the Global Environmental Facility that was set up after the Rio Conference in 1992. This is where the money is going through. And this is how countries are going to be bankrupted and are being bankrupted and have been bankrupted. It's an agency of the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank is a trustee of the global financial system. It's basically called the Global Environmental Facility, and the World Bank is a trustee which carries out the orders of the Global Environmental Facility. So yes, the Global Environmental Facility administers several trust funds and provides secretariat services on an interim basis for the Adaptation Fund. Mitigation, this is where the money is. The Global Environmental Facility Trust Fund was established on the eve of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, who'd have thought, to help tackle our planet's most pressing environmental problems. The Global Environmental Facility funding was to support the projects to be contributed to by donor countries, taxed by this fund. These financial contributions are replenished every 4 years. They have the replenishment documents, the Global Environmental Facility replenishment documents, and there's 39 donor countries. The funds are available to developing countries and countries with economies in transition to meet the objectives of the international environmental conventions and agreements. That's what we're talking about now. That's exactly how the public are going to be looted. That's what the Citizens' Assembly in Oxford was all about, getting people to retrofit their houses at 25 grand a pop. This is how the banks are going to own everything. Well, there's one bank that does own everything, the World Bank. The Global Environmental Facility has several key roles, it says here, to play under the Paris Agreement. It serves as part of the financial mechanism of the agreement. Get that. This is the financial mechanism of the Paris Agreement, which also established a process for ensuring that all actions on climate change are fully transparent, with a mechanism for helping countries meet that goal. They help the countries to meet the goal by lending them money, by indebting the country. And the money's in mitigation, so they sell them green technology that doesn't work, that impoverishes the country and brings it under the control of the bank. Can you see how this works? It's very, very simple. Such a good idea. What a brilliant business plan. Not very good for the general public, however. The Global Economic Facility's climate change mitigation strategy is financed through the GEF Trust Fund. It supports developing countries as they make transformational shifts towards low-emission development pathways with three fundamental objectives. Now, this is what Theresa May voted for before she slunk off into nowhere. Promoting innovation and technology transfer for sustainable energy breakthroughs, in other words, carbon neutrality. Demonstrating mitigation options with systemic impacts by strengthening interaction and integration between climate change mitigation and other areas. The GEF focal areas are mainstreaming mitigation concerns into sustainable development strategies through the continuing support of enabling conditions in developing countries. The idea of all this, of course, is to destroy the Western nations, which is what Extinction Rebellion state is one of their goals in their aims. The inevitable collapse of Western democracies is what they're talking about. More details on each of the objectives above are provided in the climate change mitigation page in the Global Environmental Facility. Look it up, folks, it's all there. The Global Environmental Facility's Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which is financed through the Least Developed Countries Fund. That's it. Yes, it does exist. The LDCF, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund, the SCCF, aims at supporting developing countries to move to a climate-resilient development pathway, while reducing exposure to the immediate risks posed by climate change. Mitigation. The GEF adaptation strategy hinges upon three main pillars: reduce vulnerability and increase resilience through innovation and technology transfer for adaptation. In other words, green technology that doesn't work. Mainstream adaptation and resilience for systemic impact. Foster enabling conditions for effective and integrated adaptation. In other words, you impoverish every country, you lend them loads of money, sell them technology that doesn't work, and then you own them. Very, very simple. More details, it says here, on the LDCF and the SCCF Climate Adaptation Programme are available on the Climate Change Adaptation page. Do go to the Global Economic Facilities website. It's all on there. All our projects, it says, and programmes can be consulted in our database for detailed descriptions of activities and results in Madrid, Spain, Skyline, blah. Yeah. That's at the UNFCCC COP25. They're referring to there. GEF-funded projects have had a tangible impact on climate change. I bet they have. Well, the weather's stayed the same, but they've had a tangible impact on the countries that they've been implementing it in. Reducing the vulnerability of almost 27 million people in more than 130 countries. This is a big business. Supporting nearly 1,000 climate change mitigation projects expected to contribute 8.4 billion tonnes of direct and indirect greenhouse gas emission reductions over time. Poverty for all. It says here, looking ahead, under GEF7, the GEF will continue to foster the shift to a low-carbon economy by supporting creative thinking and innovative financing. Yes, innovative financing. The efforts are structured to address the key decisions for the Paris Agreement, blah-de-blah. The establishment and operationalisation of the Green Climate Fund has added to the evolving context in which the GEF operates. The Climate Change Focal Area Strategy is complementary to programming by the Green Climate Fund and other climate funds, and lays the foundations for enhanced climate action by harnessing synergies across the different focal areas. The purpose of the facility is to lend money to the poorest countries. Money is obviously printed by the IMF out of thin air and guaranteed by our governments. The facility seeks wilderness areas rich in minerals as security. What's the Wild 11 conference about next year? They are going to take as security 50% of the Earth's land and seas. Now, if I can work this out, ladies and gentlemen, why aren't more people talking about it? Because it requires about half an hour's research to start researching it, right? And you can listen to George Hunt, Unsaid, The Elite Plan Well Ahead on YouTube. We actually play it in our talks sometimes because people have no idea how far this goes back and that there was somebody trying to warn us about this at the time. Basically, it says we give away our tax money for what? Yeah, let's have a look at this. When a country cannot repay loans to the GEF, it must give up a piece of its territory to the Rothschild Bank, the IMF and World Bank, basically. That's all this is about. Next year, they're giving half the world away. The total amount of land involved can be as much as 30% of the Earth's surface. Well, they've upped it now, haven't they? It's 50% next year. If land cannot be offered as collateral, the country must starve, like Haiti, Argentina, and many others. Rothschild's stroke of genius was that he had his GEF smuggled into the UN system at the Rio UN summit in '92 by his friend Maurice Strong. Thus, high-ranking ministerial officials from 179 countries are practically co-opted onto the council of the bank, thereby endorsing Mr. Rothschild's business plan. The GEF is to manage the money which was promised to the developing countries at Copenhagen, $100 billion a year from 2020 to 2030. That's why they want it all in place by 2030, because everyone's going to be completely impoverished to the World Bank by 2030. That's why we need to mitigate by 2030. It's nothing to do with the weather. It's to do with gaining outcomes for the World Bank. That's when the World Bank will own everything. The establishment and operationalizationalism of the Green Climate Fund has added to the evolving context in which the GEF operates. The GEF 7 Climate Change Focal Area Strategy is complementary to programming the Green Climate Fund and other climate funds and lays the foundation for enhanced climate action by harnessing synergies across the different focal areas and building on the GEF's record of driving innovation. So it was established in 1991. The GEF, that is, and is today the largest funder of projects to improve the global environment. It has allocated 8.8 billion, supplemented by more than 38.7 billion in co-financing for more than 2,400 projects in more than 165 developing countries. The GEF partnership includes 10 agencies. Guess who's number one? The United Nations Development Programme. What a surprise. The UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, started by Maurice Strong. The World Bank, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a UN agency, of course, the UN Industrial Development Organization, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who actually fund protests. They funded the Women's March in London a few years ago. Remember that? When they were protesting against Trump, but they didn't know why they were there. That was funded by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The Inter-American Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Right. N.M. Rothschild was poised to earn tens of millions through doing this. Yeah, there's also a billionaire called Oleg Deripaska, Deripaska. He's a bank advisor, an intimate friend of Nathan Rothschild. He was able to tap the World Bank's International Finance Corporation and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development for a loan of 150 million to his Basic Element vehicle in 2006. Deripaska is one of 16 global business leaders who drafted CEO climate policy recommendations to G8 leaders, a document outlining international business community's proposals to effectively tackle global warming, or globalist warming as it should be called. Right, so the decision to make the GEF an independent organisation enhanced the involvement of developing countries in the decision-making process and in implementation of the project. Since 1994, the World Bank has served as the trustee of the Global Environmental Facility Trust Fund. The World Bank is the trustee of the Global Environmental Facility Trust Fund and provided administrative services. I bet it did. As part of the restructuring, the GEF was entrusted to become the financial mechanism for both the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a big business, folks. Can you see how it all fits together now? The GEF started funding projects that enable the Russian Federation and nations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia to phase out their use of ozone-destroying chemicals, which is now fossil fuels. GEF projects in climate change help developing countries and economies in transition to contribute to the overall objectives of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Sustainability. As the financial mechanism, the GEF allocates and disperses about 250 million. It supports projects in, guess what? Yes, I think you're catching on. Climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Food crisis and the global land grab. In other words, Rothschild's vested interest, as ushered in by his henchman George Soros, recently became the largest shareholder in Adeco Agro, one of the leading agribusinesses in South America. Jim Rogers, a quantum partner of Rothschild and Soros. This is a fellow that broke the Bank of England in 92 and forced South Asian currencies to devaluate sharply. He says, I'm convinced that farmland is going to be one of the best investments of our time. No kidding. Lord Jacob Rothschild thinks that right now is an excellent point of entry for taking a long-term position in agriculture. Rothschild invested 36 million for a 24% stake in AgriFarma Brazil. Jacob Rothschild has bought 100,000 acres in Brazil and holds an option on another 60,000 acres. Basically, it goes on and on and on. The International Food Policy Institute estimated that globally, 15 to 20 million hectares, an area the size of Uruguay, have been under negotiation since 2006. Big buyers are China, Daewoo Company, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, in particular in Africa. This leaving the Africans with even less food at their disposal. There have been riots against this in Madagascar and Kenya. This is going back to 2010, by the way. So this is absolutely fascinating stuff. This is how it all came into being, and the return to global warming. Basically, this is where it all came from. An official global governance pseudoscience and control and management system brought to you, ladies and gentlemen, by two people. Maurice Strong and Edmund Rothschild. It's not a conspiracy theory. Let's now hear what Maurice Strong and Edmund Rothschild had to say in 1992. Previous to that. Let's go back to 1987, where we started, to the World Wilderness Congress, which was attended by the whistleblower George Hunt. We'll have a listen to that now.
If you want to talk, I will call you collect. So send me your phone
This is
number.
George Hunt now.
The light of freedom is going out throughout the world. You know who the culprits are now. It may not be too late to educate key people who can stop them. And you, watching this videotape, are one of the sparks that may ignite the countryside into flames of indignation against these people.
Now, I put that on at the beginning. We're going to hear from Edmund Rothschild and Maurice Strong, but that is what George Hunt said at the end of that broadcast. And he offered to call people collect who called him. He was absolutely exposing these people, and look where we are now. Greta Thunberg is Time Magazine Person of the Year. The human race are devolving. Let's hear from Edmund Rothschild and Maurice Strong.
Perhaps society still has some leaders that won't let us down. Goodbye and God bless you.
So let's get the proceedings running now, and we will see how we go. Thank you. Mr. Maurice Strong, whom most of you already know.
Thank you very much, and you've already heard perhaps too much from me, so I think we're reaching the point at which we want to involve you, all of you, in the next step of this conference, which is really to come to grips with some of the principal action-oriented issues. And one of the most important initiatives that is open here for your consideration is that of the conservation banking program. As we mentioned this morning, we have as our chairman, fortunately, the person who really is the source of this very significant concept. He is one of the trustees of the International Wilderness Foundation, which sponsored this meeting. He was at the first of these congresses. So his conversion to the relationship between conservation and economic development has been a pioneering one. His work on mini dams. I used to be in the hydroelectric power part of the energy business myself. Many of the energy developments that we've seen have come from his early anticipation of our energy needs and his early work in supporting pioneering initiatives to deal with these needs. So there is no better person. He epitomizes in his own life that positive synthesis between environment, conservation on the one hand, and economics on the other. And I'm just delighted to have this opportunity of introducing to you Edmund de Rothschild.
Morris, thank you very much indeed for all that you've said, and I would ask the audience to take with a slight grain of salt all that he has said about me. And I want to start there a little bit of my talk to you on a somewhat different vein. You see, in order to further the ideals of the world wilderness concept and to prevent the concept and this concept just to remain an ideal, it is of paramount importance to find ways and means of finding and promoting its rationale. There are these ways and means of putting this concept into effect and overcoming or minimizing some of the problems set out by the speakers in this Congress, such as pollution, prevention of acid rain, waste disposal. There are alternative methods and harmless alternative methods for energy, and they're available. Alternative uses of water resources not involving vast inundations of land or displacing humans and its indigent wildlife, harnessing wave energy, solar energy, wind power, just to mention a few. To overcome the chilling, doom-laden prognostications of Dr. Irving Mintzer's greenhouse effect, perhaps it could be possible to utilize CO2, carbon dioxide, one of its main causes, to manufacture dry ice, to maintain the polar caps and the actual temperature of the ice there, and maintain their present temperature. Innovative and modern technology, world waste material, collected and perhaps burnt in volcanic areas or buried so deep in the earth, in the wilderness desert areas of the mid-Sahara where nobody goes, or in the empty quarter in Arabia or the Gobi Desert. But all these ideas and visions, some far-fetched, and above all, the continuation of this Congress needs money. A start has been made by the thoughts and care of one man. Michael Sweetman. His ideas have had lip service paid to them by some of our speakers here during the Denver conference. The meetings now of the new concept of an international conservation banking program involves all sectors of the human community. Governmental and intergovernmental agencies, the public and private agencies, large charitable foundations, as well as ordinary individuals worldwide. Michael Sweetman has written the foreword to this concept. Its final form will no doubt be altered, watered down, or widened. But this convention must put forward this charter. And with the collective wisdom available here today, the charter can be enhanced, embracing those who have given their thoughts in the Denver Public Forum. By thinking forward as to how to reach out to the public at large,
to every corporate entity throughout the world to put aside, hopefully tax-free, a part of their profits to fund our ecological and environmental protection. Ladies and gentlemen, every country has its own problems, its indigenous peoples and its wildlife. This International Conservation Bank must know no frontiers, no boundaries. Its funds must be used constructively and not to be challenged into greedy hands or weapons of destruction. I hesitate to link this bank with world wilderness, but I would like to link it with our survival as a human race. This, our generation, must not be cursed by our descendants, if we have any, as to the greatest destructors and squanderers of the world's resources. That great philosopher and cleric, Teilhard de Chardin, wrote, and I quote, "Man can harness the winds, the waves, and the tides. But when he can harness the energy of love, then for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." Michael Sweetman. Michael Sweetman, your love for the world wilderness concept has given you the necessary fire in your belly to produce the germ of the future needs of this concept. And I have great pleasure in asking you to put it forward.
Well, that was very interesting, wasn't it, ladies and gentlemen? That was Edmund de Rothschild there, speaking in 1987. World Wilderness Congress, outlining the plan which I've been talking about for the past hour. And George Hunt was warning the world about from 1988 onwards. George Hunt has now left the planet. He's not with us anymore, but his website is still there. thebigbadbank.com, where you can buy 4 of his DVDs for $13. And the information in those is absolutely vital to people who want to understand this. So I'm just going to play the beginning of that audio again of what George Hunt had to say. And people might want to ponder on that and think about what they're going to do about this.
If you want to talk, I will call you Collect. So send me your phone number. The light of freedom is going out throughout the world. You know who the culprits are now. It may not be too late to educate key people who can stop them. And you, watching this videotape, are one of the sparks that may ignite the countryside into flames of indignation against these people. Perhaps society still has some leaders that won't let us down. Goodbye and God bless you.
Well, that's it from this edition, special edition of Windows on the World. We're going to be doing more on this. I'm going to be doing more specials. And that was the man who saw the future, George Hunt. So do look him up and look into what we've been saying tonight and spread the word, because this is a global action plan implemented at a local level. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net.